Schedule F. Whiskey Tango Foxtrot is that. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is another declaration of truth from your host, Terry A. Hurlbut. Washington is buzzing, has been buzzing for several days over an executive order that escaped the public notice when Trump issued it last October, in October of 2020, that is. That order created a new class of federal employees, Schedule F, that would not be civil service anymore. Instead, Schedule F employees would be at-will employees whom a president could fire at will. New reports now reveal that President Trump will reinstate Schedule F if he runs for and wins a second term, which Trump will announce one way or another in 2 days. Before I get into detail, I want to shout out to the sponsor of this channel, which is Conservative News and Views. Link in the description. Be sure to check out the awesome CNAV Store. Scroll down near the bottom of that link. Lots of good merchandise there, including this t-shirt that I have chosen for today. It reads, "Boy, did I call it or what?" Signed, George Orwell. Now, the Schedule F executive order exists today only on a National Archives host called Trump White House, all rolled into one. But don't worry about that. I've left a link to it in the description. It relies on Title V United States Code sections 3301, 3302, and 7511. Section 3 of this EO holds the key principle: accepted service, appointments of individuals to positions of confidential, policy-determining, policy-making, or policy-advocating character that are not normally subject to change as a result of a presidential transition shall be made under Schedule F of the accepted service, as established by Section 4 of this order. Now, Section 4 defines the employment schedules. Schedule A is for non-confidential and non-policy staff that are not subject to written exams because it's not practical. Schedule B is for non-confidential and non-policy staff subject to non-competitive written exams only. Schedule C is for confidential or policy-making staff that are normally subject to leave with a new president, normally asked to leave with a new president. Schedule D, non-confidential and non-policy staff subject to relaxed competitive service rules. The reason? The strict rules would prevent recruitment of enough staff to fill these jobs. Schedule E, administrative law judges. And last but not least, Schedule F, confidential or policy-making staff that are not normally asked to leave with a new president. The order further directs all agency heads to review all positions, especially in Schedules A, B, and D, the non-confidential and non-policy staff positions other than the ALJs. The idea is to identify which jobs really are of a confidential, policy-determining, policy-making, or policy-advocating character. Schedule F would receive all such functionaries that a new president does not normally replace at transition. Now, who would go into Schedule F? Schedule F staff would include writers of policies, rules, regulations, and guidance. All staff who do substantive policy-related work. Any supervisors of attorneys. Anyone having substantial discretion to determine how an agency does its job. People who handle privileged policy, regulatory, or other documents and report directly to a GS-13 or higher paid supervisor, or are part of the executive secretariat or equivalent of any given agency. And anyone who negotiates union contracts. Now, if President Trump felt the need to write such an order, you know that many federal employees have duties of confidential and or policy-making nature and have not been subject to dismissal when a new president takes office. This kind of hanger-on is likely responsible for much of the the continued misery from which Trump repeatedly promised relief. This, then, was that swamp Trump promised to drain. It also contains the embeds of the deep state. Its members take their orders from the deep state and not from any president. Axios reported on July 22nd what this might mean. Here is their most reasonable interpretation. Quote, the impact could go well beyond typical conservative targets, such as the Environmental Protection Agency and the Internal Revenue Service. Trump allies are working on plans that would potentially strip layers at the Justice Department, including the FBI, and reaching into national security, intelligence, the State Department, and the Pentagon, sources close to the former president say. Close quote. Now, the civil service protections that the accepted service categories, especially Schedule F, would revoke, date back to 1939. In that year, Congress passed an act to prevent pernicious political activities and named it after Senator Carl Hatch of New Mexico. This Hatch Act forbids lower-level staff to take any role whatsoever in a political campaign. In return, presidents do not fire such employees wholesale. But this does not apply to the president, vice president, any appointee requiring Senate confirmation, or to Schedule C staff. It is supposed to apply to staff in Schedules A, B, D, and E. Now, I took postgraduate training in laboratory medicine at Vanderbilt University affiliated hospitals. During that time, I periodically was on the payroll of the Veterans Administration and afterward the Department of Veterans Affairs. That came with a house staff position at the Nashville Veterans Administration Medical Center. Whenever I held such assignment and was on a federal payroll, I was subject to the Hatch Act and regularly viewed wall posters detailing Hatch Act provisions and obligations. All VA hospital staff understood that while they may vote, they may not campaign on work time for a particular political candidate or public question, bring campaign material to the workplace, or use copiers or other workplace resources in aid of a campaign. Again, on the flip side, new presidents did not change out all the staff at a VA hospital. I knew many VA employees who had served for decades and seen presidents and administrators of the Veterans Administration and then afterwards secretaries of Veterans Affairs come and go. But beginning with the Obama administration, many federal employees who did in fact have policy-making duties abused the privilege of the Hatch Act. Before I get into it, I want to shout out to another sponsor, BitNext. This is your replacement for Zoom, Slack, the Google G Suite, Microsoft Office 365, Dropbox, WeTransfer, and Chili Piper, among others. Unlike any of them, BitNext protects your content and conversations so well that even the administrators can't see it. So this is your channel for secure comms, conferencing, cloud storage, and file sharing. Best of all, everything is back-end, so you don't even need client software. If you have a browser, you can use BitNext. Follow the link to the very bottom and give them a try. 28 days free of charge. Can't beat that with a stick. Now then, recall Axios' statement that the EPA and the IRS have become favorite conservative targets. Lois Lerner, director of the Exempt Organizations Unit at the IRS, was by all odds the worst offender. She regularly discriminated against conservative organizations by reason of their viewpoints. She did most of this before the 2012 election, which is part of the reason Barack Obama coasted to re-election. The other part is that Mitt Romney ran his campaign to lose. And she brazenly refused to apologize. Now, despite clear evidence of her blatantly political activities at the IRS, President Trump couldn't prosecute her. I think there were two reasons for that. First, everything Lois Lerner did at the IRS she could legally excuse. Word is she sacrificed a few left-leaning exempt organizations to cover for her viewpoint discrimination against right-leaning organizations. Second, the Justice Department was already salted with deep state players who simply refused to prosecute or even investigate. The Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Power campaign is the nearest equivalent to the abuses at the IRS, but of course, the Supreme Court in West Virginia versus CPA clipped their wings, but good. In any case, Axios has correctly identified the FBI and many intelligence agencies as likely presidential targets. The reason is simple. The deep state is compromised. Now, how did that happen? This happened because before Donald Trump, no president cared about the basic liberties of the people. So they let these people with dubious loyalties get into these positions. Again, we're talking about positions of confidential, policy determining, policy making, and policy advocating character. No one bothered to check on what any of these people were doing. Neither did anyone check on whether these people were carrying out a given president's wishes or taking care to follow and execute the law. Now, obviously, any agent of the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, the DEA, and any other law enforcement or intelligence agency holds a position of a confidential character. Likewise, someone beyond a certain level at the EPA, OSHA, the CDC, the FDA, the FAA, the NHTSA, or wherever holds a position of a policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating character. The potential for political abuse by holders of these positions is too great to ignore. Yet the American people have ignored that potential, and for too long. At least halfway through his administration, Donald Trump learned the hard way about that potential for abuse and its realization. He determined to do something about it, and Schedule F was the result. President Biden rescinded that executive order. President Biden is a tool, maybe a willing tool of the deep state. But President Trump, as soon as he can return to office, will likely reinstate it. The wailing banshees at Axios are already running through the streets, screaming at the top of their lungs. As many as 50,000 federal employees, 2.5% of the workforce, could land on Schedule F. No longer could they count on seeing presidents and secretaries of whatever come and go. Whether all 50,000 would go, apparently is not quite settled. Now, I recommend that they all go. You can't trust them, period. Now, Axios admits that the deep state caught Trump napping in 2017. They speak of, and I quote, the slapdash and virtually non-existent infrastructure surrounding Trump ahead of his 2017 presidential transition, unquote. Unquote Axios. Clearly, Trump has learned the value of a thorough game plan and knowing whom to trust and whom not to trust. The weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth are something you've got to see to believe. Listen to this. Such pendulum swings and politicization could threaten the continuity and quality of service to taxpayers, the regulatory protections, the checks on executive power, and other aspects of American democracy. Wrong! The deep state has politicized, compromised, and turned the federal government into an instrument not of service but of tyranny. The problem is that the administrative state has no checks on it, not even from a new president. Notice also that Axios has to use that word again, democracy. Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. So complaints on behalf of the wolves ring singularly hollow. Schedule F is only an intermediate step, a way of dealing with what we have until we can change it. The definitive way to change the regulatory part of the administrative state is to abolish it. Do away with quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial executive agencies. Vest this rule-making power in elected officials only, members of Congress, in committees, subcommittees, and sub-subcommittees, and vest judgment in cases of regulatory violation back in our courts of law. That leaves the intelligence and law enforcement communities. These are the positions of a confidential character, the handlers of confidential, secret, and top secret material. The security and intelligence services of any country have always been the most dangerous to the liberties of the people. They can also make or break heads of state, which is all the more reason to make them accountable for job performance or job subversion. So I urge President Trump to ignore the banshee wails. They are, in fact, an indication that he is on exactly the right track. Link in the description of the article to the text of the Schedule F EO and to conservative news and views. I have another link to the awesome online store and to BitNext, as I also mentioned. And if you like what you've heard, you can like this video. On the end screen, I'm going to put in a subscribe link and also links to 2 videos about the Supreme Court's actions on executive branch powers. This is Terry A. Hurlbut delivering another declaration of truth and reminding you to let the truth set you free.